So we'll start with setting our motivation. So we cultivate the minds of refuge and bodhicitta and faith, confidence. Confidence based on our own direct experiences, having put to whatever degree teachings into practice in our own lives and seen, at least briefly, that those antidotes do in fact reduce the strength, the frequency, the duration of disturbing states of mind, hatred, jealousy, covetousness, ill will, and seeing how that process has unfolded in the lives of all of the great masters of the past who have gone even further, have fully trained their mind, accomplished the ultimate aim of the path, their enlightenment. And on that basis, we can understand that the Buddha and his teachings and those practitioners who have fully realized his teachings are a source, the ultimate source of refuge, that which is completely reliable, that which we can turn to for guidance and protection, and that our interest in all of this is to ultimately become fully enlightened. And the purpose of that is not for oneself alone, but to provide oneself with the skills, the tools, the ability to be of perfect, limitless benefit to sentient beings. So we think in that way and cultivate those minds of refuge, and faith and bodhicitta. All right. Are there any questions from last class before we move on? All right. So
I don't know. Sorry. I just wanted to say that I'm grateful to have heard the advice to in order to make things smoother and easier, to be more gentle about the approach, because I think we get not anxious so much as maybe excited, or our goals are lofty, whatever, and then it becomes a little intense. So to be able to back off a bit it was just very helpful to hear that.
Yeah, Lama Yeshe, I think, has a very skillful, uh, you know, way of presenting things, for newer, the Western mind, and for, it's like, good enough dear is kind of the phrase that he's kind of known for, like, oh, that's, yeah, you just go slowly, and um, you don't push too hard, too fast. And yeah, it's really about, like with our Be Your Own Therapist class, which is inspired by his, approach. Another way of thinking about it in terms of, the wisdom aspect of things is also like be your own scientist, in a way. And just like we were saying, just to get curious about these things and just have a kind of sense of exploration, and just like, yeah, I wonder why it is like this. I wonder why I experience things like this. Um, and then as you are trying to answer that question, you stumble on the same kinds of things without having to be like so, you know dogmatic or so rigorous about it. You just sort of investigate. Uh, so it seems like in this section, we've covered the selflessness of persons. I don't know. I mean, to some degree, I'm sure it'll crop up um, here or there a little bit, but the focus is going to shift a bit because we've said that from the Madhyamaka Prasangika approach, it becomes necessary to establish not only the selflessness of persons, but also the selflessness of phenomena. And of course, one way of doing that is, and ultimately, as we've said, um, the analysis is the same, the emptiness is the same. It's just the object. Either the object is oneself, or the object is that which is cognizable that is not oneself. Um, Everything else, um, and we are advised, really, ultimately, to predominantly focus on establishing the selflessness of ourselves. And once we do that, it's very easy. So it seems like, from what they say, is that it's the same sense, it's the same emptiness, and it's the same process. You establish the selflessness of oneself, and then you can generalize that to the selflessness of phenomena. But still, we're going to, look at it, um, in terms philosophically, here. So in day 354, Lama Yeshe says everything we experience, feelings, sensations, shapes, and colors, comes from our mind. So this is talking about this. We know that when we apprehend, we've talked a lot about the false I, recognizing the false I, investigating the false I, seeing the emptiness of the false I. And but that tendency to project is true in terms of things that are outside of oneself, one's cognition of the outside world. Um, so he says when we look at the outside world, we have a very strong impression of its substantiality. In the same way that when we look internally, we also have a very strong impression of the substantiality of the ego identity. But he says we probably don't realize, and of course, obviously we don't, that the strong impression is merely our own mind's interpretation of what it sees. He says we think that the strong, solid reality really exists outside. He says this is a misconception. The strong impression that the world appears to truly exist is actually a projection of our own mind. And then he gives an example of someone who, invents something. And, of course, um, everything, in the world is either part of the existent natural, completely natural, like plants or animals, um, or it's an invention of the human mind, houses and cars and tires and computers and calculators, um, even forks and knives and plates and, every lights. Um, Everything is sort of in one of those two categories. Um, and in either case, so of course, the easiest, I think the example that's here is one that makes the point in an easier way, talking about kind of a recent invention, the idea of like a suborbital, like a satellite is what he gives um, and again, he taught in the 70s, so again, probably the first satellites were in the 50s or something, 40s or 50s. So at that time, it was, and probably TV and things were still, those inventions were not that old, so satellites were maybe a little bit more exciting than they are now. um, but you know that idea, um, up until whatever the 40s, probably they were probably, I think they were in science fiction, maybe in the 20s and 30s, or even maybe the 1800s, who knows. But the first actual working satellite, I think it was just sort of a piece of reflective metal that they literally bounced signals off of. um, but rather than like a device that beamed signals from itself. But still, that all, even when it was just an idea, and there's examples of things that appeared in literature and then became, an actual physical thing in the world. But still, this the product of the mind, of creativity. um, and you have to give it a name, like microwave ovens. We had to discover the microwave as a thing. And then somebody thought, well, oh, now that we can do something with that. And like x-ray machines, we discovered that x-rays were a thing, and then we figured out, oh, we can actually make them, and here's what you can do with that. And now you've got a thing. And we're like, oh yeah, of course. Now every time you see a microwave oven, you're like, oh, it's a microwave oven, like it's always existed, like it's just sort of always been there. um, but it had to be brought into the world, and then it had to be given a name, and then it had to be sort of internalized culturally, for people who knew how to relate to it. And the same, of course, is true of the natural world. There are things that, um, you discover. I think the first time I had seen, like, fruit, the date fruit, like at the grocery store, but I didn't really have a healthy diet so I think the first time that I ate a date, I think it was like 20 years ago. I think I was 20, 21. Um, and they were so good. I actually emailed my dad and I was like, have you ever had date fruit? Like, these are amazing. Um, because they're like candy. They're amazing. Um, and I had never, I had apples and bananas, but dates are like different. So kind of discovered this thing, and then because I discovered it, like now I go to the grocery store, I'm like, okay, that's a date, that's a persimmon, that's a, you know, and I recently had kumquats for the first time, a bag of, I really recommend kumquats too. They're really good in smoothies, and oh, they're amazing. They're very sharp, they're very intense, but um, yeah, for salads and smoothies, they're very nice. Um, and so we're doing the same thing, like, oh, and like, like what is this kind of bunny versus, this other kind of thing. And we have to learn that, like, that's also, it's just merely labeled, like, we say, well, if it looks like this, it's this, and if it looks slightly different, like the difference between like an alligator and a crocodile, like they're very similar, but we've just decided, oh well, if the tail is a little bit longer or whatever, and it's like freshwater versus whatever, then it's this versus that. um, and and then the only thing that appears to the mind is the label, is that concept. And of course, a lot of that is also kind of internal too, unique to us, because our reaction to it isn't only just the label. Our reaction to it is also our own personal history with it, whether we find it attractive or unattractive, or we think it's causing harm. Like, some people might look at a nuclear reactor and think, oh, well, that's clean energy, that's, the future. But other people who might have been, affected by a nuclear meltdown, or they might be really afraid of it, or think that it's, too dangerous. Same object, but very, very different opinions about it. Or food, some people really think that something is delicious, other people think the same thing is horrible. um, but they are going to use, if they're part of the same culture and they've learned, the same uh, words and things, they are going to still refer to it in the same, using the same word. um, but the fact that people have these different opinions about the same objects is also is part of what establishes the selflessness of phenomena. Because if it did, have that essence to it, this projection that Lama Yeshe is describing, then there would only be one way of relating to it, because it has an essence, and that is its essence, is to be like that. And we would all have to agree that that is what it's like. But we all, even though we might use the same label, we have very different views about it, because it doesn't actually have that essence. But people will still, defend their views about, like, no, this really is gross, or no, how can you say that it's gross? It's really amazing. And they both think that they're right, and they're talking about what they think is the same thing. But their culture plays a role, their own experiences, past experiences play a role. um, but all of that, we have to, on another level, we have to come into an existing culture that has already discovered these things, labeled these things, basically to some degree told us what's the right word to use, what is its function, so that we don't, put, the wrong, we all know not to put like tinfoil in the microwave, because that doesn't, you can put it in a regular oven, but not a microwave oven. And we had to learn all of that thing. We had to come into a culture that already had these labels and all of this already established, in order for us to have what appears to us to be just the noticing of what is out there. Um, it isn't like that. We are, as Lama Yeshe says, we're projecting on top of what's there, and we're using all of these filters that we're getting from the existing culture, from our family, our history. And then we're also, some of those are unique to our own preferences as well. But it's being filtered through all of these different lenses, and that's giving rise to this substantiality that isn't truly present in the object. So, questions are. So really, in the next day, he just kind of furthers this analysis with another example, which is very common. We've used it, the example of a table, could be the example of a car, it doesn't matter. And he just kind of says that the quotation, this is now Lama Zopa Rinpoche on day 355, a table is not non-existent. It is not the concrete thing we normally think it is. And of course, table, any noun is applicable for the word table. So again, it's important, he's reminding us, Lama Zopa is reminding us not to go too far and negate to the point of nihilism, but to also not negate insufficiently so that we have the view of eternalism. Um, and again, he uses our view in which we believe is a projection that is not the reality. So that, again, reiterating that every action that an ordinary being like us is taking with regard to what's being cognized, the way in which we're actually in relationship to what we're cognizing is really just the projection. That's that label that we talked about in the previous day 354. The label is the only way in which we are really, as an unenlightened being, the only way in which we're actually in relationship to whatever it is that we're cognizing. So he uses, just another example of a table. He says, again, a leg of the table is not the table. And because it's a part of the table, we would say that the leg belongs to the table. Any part of the table is not the table. Even the collection of the parts is not the table. It's the basis of the table. So again, this is getting back to this idea that we had before of a valid base, the valid base. For establishing the selflessness of a person, the valid base is the body and the mind together, the combination. A dead person is not a person. A dead body is not a human being. Even a dead animal is not. You wouldn't say, if your dog died, you wouldn't introduce someone who came to the door, say, this is my dog. Just like you wouldn't talk about a person that that had passed away, is you would say this was so and so, because the valid base of a person requires body and mind together. Um, and so, he's saying all of the parts of the table is not the table. But it is a valid base for the label of table. Why? Because it's a full surface with, you know, I don't know, three or more legs. I don't know if you could, I suppose there may be some sort of tables that have two really wide legs that could be a table, but it has to have a relatively flat base that you can put things on. It doesn't, you can't get on it and go somewhere. It's not going to make your food hot. It's not going to produce sound. You can't record a video with it. It's a flat surface that you can put things on. And because it's a flat surface with some sort of configuration of legs, then it's a table because it performs the function of a table. If you could record a video with it, if it did produce sound, then it would be a valid base for calling it a camera or a video, camera, or a speaker, or because that's the function that it performs. That collection of parts would perform a unique function, and therefore it would, conventionally speaking, be able to be referred to as the valid base that for the label of whatever culture you're in has given to that kind of object that performs that kind of function. He says, table is merely imputed by the mind. Table exists in mere name, independent upon its base. Therefore, there is no concrete table, no real table from its own side. We can see that the table is completely empty of being a table that exists from its own side. So it doesn't exist, just like a person doesn't exist from its own side, but a person does exist. It exists as a dependent arising, that which arises in dependence upon. Here, what's being emphasized here is parts, but also, as we've talked about before, the three ways in which all conventionally existent phenomena are dependent arisings are because they depend on not only their parts, but also their causes and the conditions. So, tables don't just appear in fields. They don't just arise spontaneously. They are constructed. They have to be machined in some, and of course, a wooden table, a metal table, a stone table. They're machined in different ways, but you have to, and to some degree, you could have a makeshift table, but still, you've put it, that is still something that has causes and conditions because you put it, unless you could find some sort of rock formation and just say, oh, we're going to use this like a table. That's true. But when we say table, we kind of mean something that a person buys or makes to use in their own home. um, and but but because that label refers to a function, then it's true. You could say, well, this has a flat surface and it does hold things. So I'm going to use this naturally occurring phenomena to be like my table for right now. But still, it's not really a table, in the sense it's not a man-made kind of thing that we invented. Nobody really invented the label of table up to the point where people were making them for human use. So you're just kind of drawing an analogy rather than the actual thing that you're referencing. Um, so it was put together in some way, and it has parts, and then also there's the act of mental imputation, the act of mental labeling. And on the basis of those three things, this this mental construct of table arises because you've got the causes and the conditions, you've got the parts, and then you've got people coming along and referring to it like that, saying, well, as a society, we're going to look at things that perform that function, and to make society work, and we're going to say that that's a table. And so now, if you want to buy a table, you're not going to go to a restaurant, you're not going to go to a dress shop, you're going to go to a place where they sell furniture. That's where you can find tables, because society organizes itself around labels and around these constructions, these mental constructions. So language is, of course, very helpful in making it, organizing people, organizing societies, getting things done, accomplishing goals. Um, but all of those things are also driving this process of concretizing what we're perceiving, and kind of helping us to, because we need to use these labels in our daily lives to make sense of the world, and um, you know get projects accomplished, and show up at the right time and do the right thing, and know how to go about achieving what we need to get done every day. That's kind of reinforcing, like, oh yeah, of course, that is a table, that is a chair, that is a computer, what have you. Any other thoughts? Any thoughts or questions? So now he's going to switch. Well, it's interesting because this is still labeled under the selflessness of phenomena. I guess it's labeled under the selflessness of phenomena because in day 356, the focus is on the mind, the emptiness of the mind. Um, as we know, as an aside, we know that from the Tibetan perspective, the emptiness of the mind is our Buddha nature, our Buddha potential, the fact, that which permits ordinary mind to become enlightened mind is the fact that mind itself is not inherently existent, is not fixed, because inherent existence, which is the opposite of dependent arising, emptiness, um, inherent existence is an impossible way for things to exist. And if they did exist that way, they would be frozen, they would be unchanging, they would be permanent. They wouldn't have any capacity for being impacted or um, having their own processes of change, of impermanence. Um, and luckily, our mind isn't like that. We're not stuck in the mind only being this personality in because I mean, even conventionally, we couldn't learn anything. We couldn't learn how to read or how to write if the mind, because we would have mind at the first moment of this life, and that mind could only be that. It couldn't become a mind that absorbed knowledge about anything, about how to read, how to do mathematics, how to construct proper grammar, etc. But the mind is empty of inherent existence, so the mind is able to be influenced by what it's directed toward, and then it develops an internal representation of what it's directed toward. And so knowledge can be gained, wisdom can be gained, and so on. So of course, and for us, we of course identify the mind as something that, as a mind possessor, as a Semchen, we of course possess mind. But mind itself is not a person, because again, a person is body and mind together. That's the only valid base for the label or designation of the word person. And of course, other sentient beings also have mind. Animals have mind, other human beings have mind. The demigods and gods and hell beings and pretas, they're all mind possessors. So in the sense of just talking about mind in isolation, then you could say it's a phenomena. It's still part of the selflessness of phenomena rather than the selflessness of persons. Um, so he says mind is a phenomena that is not body, not substantial, has no form, no shape, no color, but like a mirror can clearly reflect objects. Objects appear to the mind, and the mind can perceive these objects. Um, so he says can clearly reflect objects, not does clearly reflect objects, because for an ordinary being, he says as long as the mirror is not dirty, it will reflect whatever object comes before it clearly. But from the Buddhist perspective, the fact that our mind, as an ordinary sentient being, our mind is impacted, is colored by ignorance and affliction, the subsequent afflictions. That is the analogy there, is that our mind is dirty. Our mind is warped, in a way by the existence of the afflictions. So we don't perceive things clearly. Similarly, since the mind is unobstructed by substance form, objects can appear to it. Yeah, the phenomena that is mind perceives objects. So that is the base. So we know from, other classes on Buddhism that the definition of mind is that which is clear and knowing, or that which possesses clarity and awareness. Clarity, or is that nature of formlessness, colorlessness, and so on. And then awareness is this fact that some sort of internal representation is generated when mind is directed at an object. But we don't get to that really perfect clarity of seeing, clarity of awareness, until we ultimately become fully, we progress toward that as we move in the direction of enlightenment. We reduce the, ignorance and the other afflictions, but only really seeing clearly. Um, in relation to the phenomena, in relation to that phenomena, our thought creates, or merely imputes the label mind. So that, again, that which is clear and knowing, or that which possesses clarity and awareness, is mind. And that's how mind exists. The mind exists merely in name. What we call mind has been merely labeled by thought. He says we think there's a real mind existing. That's how it appears to us. And without a shadow of a doubt, we believe 100% in this appearance. But if we analyze this phenomenon called mind, it's no different from the name given to us by our parents, which was created by their mind. So in the mind, just like, tables are a thing that exist, and persons are a thing that isn't, to say that the mind doesn't exist. There is a phenomena that does possess clarity and awareness. When you say, oh, that's consciousness, that's mind, then, you're thinking about it in a, you could say, a culturally dependent context, given that almost every human has only ever had access to certain levels of their mind, the prevailing cultural view of the mind. And of course, that's, reiterated by, if you ask neuroscientists to describe like what the capacity of the mind is, or what the potential, or a psychologist, what the capacity or the potential of the mind is, they'll give you a very limited, kind of depressing view of like, oh, you couldn't possibly, even develop fully qualified calm abiding. That's not something that has penetrated into our culture, into Western thought, that even that is possible. And certainly not the idea that you can transcend any, um, shadow, any atom of hatred, or, jealousy or ill will, or to say that you could completely abandon even the slightest negativity, wouldn't be a view that would be held by hardly anyone in our society. So the idea that we have about mind, is, and really any time that you concretize it and you think that it's out there, um, you are projecting, you're adding something. Any questions? So then we're just given another example in day 357 of time. We've, just another example of a phenomena. And basically, Lama Zopa is just pointing out that time is also a fabrication. Time is empty of inherent existence. And the way that we, again, culturally kind of think about time, this idea of, a year, he uses the idea of a year, because what is a year? A year is just arbitrarily defined as 12 months. What is a month? Well, who knows? Sometimes it's 28 days, sometimes it's 30 days, sometimes it's 31 days. And then there's leap years, and there's leap, all kinds of things. And so, and then what is a month? It sometimes, or what is a day? A day is arbitrarily 24 hours. And that all of this just comes from, one, the sort of general cycle of the one planet that we happen to be presently experiencing, um, and two, the vision to also use the sun, the solar cycle, rather than the lunar cycle. If you use the lunar cycle, you come up with a different system of measuring time. That's, the Tibetan calendar is based on the lunar system, the Western calendar is based on the solar cycle. um, and they have different things. That's which is why, like the holy days are different days every year according to they're not, it's not once every 365 days like it would be if it was, if Chokor Du Chen was based on the solar calendar, then every single year it would be on exactly the same day. It's not that way. um, so the fact, you can just, it's all just made up. It's all just a convention that can, again, it's helpful, um, but it isn't based on anything. There's no reality to it, which is pretty. I mean, it's not something that is difficult to understand, but that's the that's what Lama Zopa is pointing out, is that we've just invented this idea of time, this idea that 12 hours is you know something, and what is an hour? An hour is 60 minutes. What's a minute? 60 seconds. What's a second? And how many seconds is? It's all just something that people just decided.
Well, then of course they also measured time in space. The farther you get from Earth, the slower time becomes. And what's that all about? So yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there are phenomena that affect um, relative, but it's time doesn't pass, for that person. It's like near a black hole or whatever. Like it's relative to something else, right? So time is empty of. It isn't to say that like there's nothing that because also you can think of time in terms of causality. You can think of time, but here he's talking about um, the way um, that we talk about time, or the way that culturally we have, the systems of time that we have invented. But of course, as you're saying, it's true. We can also think about time as causality, and we can say, well, it's true that in our universe, the arrow of time like only points in one direction. Like the things are progressing toward um, greater and greater entropy, and it's not flowing in reverse. But then the physicists would also tell you that the mathematics of that actually do work in reverse, that there's nothing, it's just incredibly unlikely that the arrow of time in the observable universe is the likeliest scenario. But the mathematics, the physics, don't actually prefer time moving in one direction or another direction. And certainly it's true that there's phenomena that um, can create differences. So there's some, you could say that there is some underlying physics in our universe for causality, and that's affected by gravity. And so, there certainly is that. Um, but so again, it doesn't mean that there is nothing at all that is referent, to this idea. It's just that it doesn't exist inherently from its own side, without, again, causes and conditions, parts, and an active mental imputation. So we're not throwing out the whole concept completely and saying there's absolutely no validity to it. It's nonsense. It's all, I mean, that's true with respect to this cultural um, idea of, saying, oh, well, this is a day, this is a month. That's all nonsense. That's all just made up. But the underlying concept of causality and so on, you could definitely say that there's physics that underlie that. Um, but it just, but that doesn't indicate that time truly exists from its own side, because it can be as as you've said, it flows differently and under different conditions. It's impacted by whether you are close to a black hole, and again, that really only, as far as I understand, like the person who the person who's experiencing time, for them, they're not. I mean, time is still flowing in the same way. It's just that when you compare that to some other place, then like when even you go up on an airplane or whatever, or you go really really fast, you start to get up to some fraction of the speed of light and so on. It's still compared to a different frame of reference in two different frames of reference, passing differently. Um, so certainly, yeah, there's a mathematical um, underpinning to that, and that's all fine. That's absolutely fine. Because all we're saying is that whatever that um, is the result of causes and conditions, parts, and an act of mental imputation, and therefore it exists as a dependent arising rather than something that exists from its own side. So the next contemplation, I can't help very much. The next contemplation, I don't know how much I can help in general, but because he's talking kind of about on day 358, the quotation is even uncaused, unproduced, and permanent phenomena are merely labeled by the mind. And then he talks about meditating on emptiness, because the realization, a person's meditative, direct, non-conceptual realization of emptiness is uncaused, unproduced, is observing a phenomena that is uncaused, unproduced, and permanent. The emptiness of a thing is not caused, isn't produced, and is permanent because it arises with that thing. Um, but then he gives, of course, this example. He says we might think that we've been meditating on emptiness, but actually, for many years and months, we've been meditating on space, not emptiness. We've believed that we're meditating on emptiness, but we've just been meditating on the sky, as if looking out of an airplane window. This is a real danger. And when it happens, it means that we've just been wasting time. He says, instead, when space appears, we should analyze it, thinking that even this space doesn't exist from its own side. Then our meditation becomes correct. It hits the right point. He says, when space appears, we don't visualize any form or substantial phenomena. Space has no appearance. However, when we are meditating on emptiness, when everything has dissolved and there is the appearance of space, we can then analyze the space. We can go beyond space. We should ask ourselves, how does this space appear to me? Does this space appear to me as merely labeled or not merely labeled? If it appears as not merely labeled by the mind, we should recognize this as a hallucination, as the object to be refuted, recognizing that space doesn't exist from its own side. He says one approach is to just look at the real space appearing from there and realize that this is a hallucination. Alternatively, we can think even this space is totally empty. We can go straight to the point like this. Space is totally empty. It does not exist from its own side. So this is very effective to go beyond space. This is the correct meditation. So, you find the phrase like space, like emptiness, um, in what they talk about in terms of emptiness. But, he's talking about meditators having this realization and actually being able. So, you know, I guess in a way it's sort of that groundlessness, that unfinding, that non-finding of the object, what you're kind of left with, like when you have searched and you have this, and you're like, okay, well, it's not here, it's not here, it's not there. Therefore, I've looked everywhere and I have to conclude it doesn't exist. It must not exist. And that, I guess, I'm not sure. It seems like he's describing that experience as being this sense of having like space, this dissolving of what seems to be concrete into the unfindability of what the projection was. And then I guess he's saying that there's a still like a subtle that you can concretize. I guess what he's saying is that meditators have found that they can reach that point, and still there's an appearance that there's a danger of continuing to concretize, and thinking that this, I guess, coarser appearance to the mind at that time is, something, I guess, almost like maybe thinking of emptiness, like we were saying, like emptiness is not a substance, it's not a level of objects. It is what you're left with. It's the understanding, the wisdom that you're left with when you've recognized that there's nothing from the object. And seems like, he's saying that meditators often will get to a certain point and then they'll think that they've found something that is the emptiness of the object, but it's an appearance to the mind that's still being concretized. And we have to analyze that and say, well, this appearance is also a projection to my mind. It's also not um, actually the emptiness. But it seems like it's a really subtle point that he's making about people who've accomplished, a pretty intense direct realization, and just that you could get stuck at that level with a wrong concept. So I can't make more sense of it than that, I don't think. Um, okay, I think that's enough for today. Any thoughts or questions? No. So I guess my thought would be it would make sense not to have class on Christmas. Were you guys wanting to? It makes no difference to me. I was thinking the most sensible thing would just be to not, but um, what are your, is that the consensus?
I would agree with that, just because getting out of the whole family Christmas thing and finding a room to sit in quietly. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we'll meet again on the 28th, and we should probably be able to finish on the 28th. That's my sense. Any questions from the class from today, or thoughts, or? Nope. Okay, so we'll end with dedication. So bring to mind the altruistic motivation that we established. Think that by having listened and participated and thought about these topics, we've actualized that motivation, which has generated positive energy in the mind. That positive energy, when it ripens, will bring about beneficial effects. So think about how you want to offer the fruit of your practice in spiritually supportive and meaningful ways.
Thank you, Venerable.